Please be seated.
I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Julia Backhaus will defend the academic thesis Transformation Multiple, Societal and Scholarly Pursuits of Sustainability. Dear candidate, dear Julia, I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. I'm honored to have the opportunity to present and defend my work before this distinguished committee, and I warmly welcome my colleagues, my family, and my friends who are here today. As a start, I would like to invite you all to briefly think about what we see in this image here, that is also shown on the cover of my thesis. We see a big bird rising high into the sky. At the same time, we are immediately aware that the bird is somewhat elusive, something like an illusion, a momentary impression, because it consists of many little black dots that we know to be individual birds, starlings actually, each doing their own thing, yet flying together. Just an instance before or after this picture was taken, the flock of birds had a different shape. Why am I talking about birds, you may wonder, and why did I choose this image, you may rightfully ask? Well, to me this single image captures quite nicely what I tried to explain in my thesis with over 100,000 words, and that I will now present to you in what is left of my 15 minutes. Being interested in sustainability and transformative change towards sustainability, I read a lot of texts and books, and I listened to and engaged with people in research, policy, and society. I was struck by the diversity of words and their meaning and all the approaches they give rise to, both in theory and practice. This multiplicity of perspectives, projects, programs, policies, all trying to achieve sustainability of some sorts, fascinated me. So I was happy to engage in different projects and with several different perspectives. For instance, I looked at 3 prominent strands of research on transformative change: sustainability transitions, socio-economic transformation, and sustainable consumption research. These scientific fields understand transformative change as either socio-technical sectoral changes or as an interplay between economy, society, and politics, or as the establishment of norms and practices that address social inequality and unsustainable consumption patterns. There are many more theories and perspectives on transformative change towards sustainability, but let's stick with these for now. They use different ideas and concepts like regime shifts, degrowth, net zero. Sometimes the same word is used, but it means different things, like reconfiguration. This shows that the meaning of terms like transformation or transition, transformative change, and even sustainability itself is not fixed or universal. Rather, it is fluid and contested, and it emerges from a specific perspective or problem framing. So scientists always have to make explicit in which corner they stand, how they look at the world, how they understand and define the words that they use. And they often do so in relation to, or even in opposition to, other scientists and their perspective, like the birds, who also position themselves in relation to others. So from this observation of multiplicity in understandings emerged my research question. How do scholarly and societal actors theorize, pursue, and thereby shape transformative change towards sustainability? And I wanted to look at both what happens in society and in science. In reality, these spheres are, of course, not as neatly divided as my honeycombs here on the slide. Science is part of society. So these spheres overlap and they intermingle and they influence each other. But how and in what ways? My book includes 7 empirical chapters. Part 1 focuses on societal initiatives and part 2 on scholarly perspectives. In my research, I address a range of different domains, so food, energy, mobility, economy. And I will now briefly present 3 chapters as examples of my work. For instance, we looked at 47 sustainable energy consumption initiatives in the Netherlands. Some of them focus on large-scale technological change, for example, home renovation programs, renewable energy systems, smart meter rollout, etc. Others focus on individual behavior change through information campaigns or nudging. Yet again, others focus on changes in everyday life situations involving smaller material components, but also addressing social norms. For example, they provide low-flow shower heads and shower timers, and I may have exceeded my time this morning. Others focus on changes in complex interaction. They aim for collaboration between stakeholder groups, including energy providers, energy users, and energy regulators. And all of these nearly 50 initiatives that we studied in the Netherlands, of these 8 focused on technology, 29 on individual behavior change, 8 on the interplay of everyday routines and their context, and only 2 on these complex interaction. So very clearly, individual behavior change emerged as the main issue of concern across these initiatives. And this trend was even stronger across countries. So just for context, this study was part of a project called Energize that looked at over 1,000 sustainable energy consumption initiatives in 30 European countries. In another study, we looked at discursive practices in transformative social innovation initiatives, and we looked at their narratives of change. So what do they consider to be the problem? What do they consider to be the solution? What do they think, who can do something about it, and how? So we reconstructed their master narrative, which is something like a widely agreed, shared, coherent story about the world and their role within it. We looked at the content of the narratives, how it's constructed, but also the role that it plays or that it is ascribed to it. Based on websites, interviews with key figures in the social innovation networks, as well as through participant observation. We arrived at the following solution strategies that the 4 initiative studies use. So Ashoka, for example, a network often for social entrepreneurs, had an interesting change in narrative from the 1 in 10 million social entrepreneur to everyone can be a change maker. But at the same time, they stuck to this focus on an individual who, given the right resources and the right support, can actually achieve great change. The global eco-village network, by contrast, focuses both on the individual and communities. It's a network of intentional communities focusing on inner transformation and system change, which is nicely captured by the quote by one of our interviewees, calling it changing the world one heart at a time, but in communities. REPES, a network of networks for social solidarity economy, focused on giving voice and visibility to this really fragmented movement. And Shareable, a media platform with news and resources, for example, handbooks for the sharing transformation, showcases examples and tools to support the sharing of items, of infrastructures, but also of time. And they support communities and cities in the commoning and democratization of resources. All of this was part of the Transformative Social Innovation Theory project. Last but not least, a word about a study on scholarly perspectives. We wanted to understand how sustainable and unsustainable food consumption practices come into being. Our initial conceptual focus was on social practices, so our everyday routines that I understood to consist of at least material objects, their meanings and competencies. And we did a mixed method study across 3 countries, Austria, Hungary, and the Netherlands, including a survey to which more than 1,000 people responded, and qualitative semi-structured interviews with 5 people in each country, so 15 in total. For example, more than a quarter of the people responding to our survey indicated difficulty of knowing whether the food they buy is regional or not, which is shown by the big blue bar on the right-hand side of the graph that you see here. This was explained variously in our interviews, for example, by this interviewee from Austria. We gave the pseudonym Claudia, who said, well, when I buy cold cuts or ham, for instance, it's very difficult at our supermarket to find out where the products are really coming from. In Austria, it is enough that the packaging is done in Austria to label it with an A. So clearly, she struggles with issues beyond her reach that form part of the system, within which she goes about her daily life. We found that the very patterned differences between practices across people and countries could best be explained by a web of entangled elements pertaining to practices, indeed, but also to carriers, so the people who carry out these practices and the systems they are part of. This was part of another project on resource efficiency called POLFREE. Now, remember this triangle? At some point, I realized that the different societal initiatives that I studied could be fitted quite neatly into the conceptual analytical space addressed by the scholarly perspectives I studied. So initiatives to pursue sustainability by societal actors resemble and can be related to concepts and ideas discussed in the scientific literature, which may not be that surprising because, as I said, these spheres interrelate. Remember the honeycombs. In other words, I was able to show that the multiplicity of perspectives in society is mirrored by the multiplicity of perspectives in science. And this realization was followed by theorization. I had already thought about and to some extent used relevant issues and concepts to consider when trying to make sense of this multiplicity I was observing. So I won't have time to go into this now, but amongst other, I was guided by the what is the problem represented to be framework in policy analysis, as well as by sense-making and social learning processes in organizational studies. So why is my book called Transformation Multiple? At the very core lies the realization that problem definitions differ and they're coupled with solution strategies. And more importantly, the problem definitions that very much resemble something like a diagnosis emerge from ways of knowing, ways of understanding, ways of looking at the world. And this strongly resonates with an argument made by a Dutch scholar called Annemarie Moore in her book called The Body Multiple, where she studies the diagnosis and treatment of a specific disease in a Dutch hospital. It means that the body or the transformation is not a singular thing or a singular entity, but depending on practices and perspectives, different diagnoses and related strategies for treatment come into being. In other words, the body and the transformation are multiple. Crucially, suggested solutions or treatments are strongly influenced and shaped by culture and context, and this insight also resonates with other relevant research in the field of science and technology studies. The next and final analytical step was describing these messy yet ordered couplings of problem definitions or diagnoses and suggested solutions or treatments, which I came to call problem solutions assemblages. I started to think about these more, and as we have seen, they consist of very heterogeneous elements. There are key driving actors, there is always a focus system, or maybe several. There's an agreed problem definition and a pursued solution strategy, but there are also transformative goals, and there are stabilizing and destabilizing elements. In my thesis, this analysis looks like this. It's a big table in the final chapter, of which you can see a part here. And important to note is that the stabilizing or destabilizing elements include practices, narratives, or institutions, but also contextual factors such as political or economic changes. So in my thesis, transformation is thus used as a broad and reflexive concept. Rather than treating it as a single fixed process or an observable outcome, I approach transformation as a boundary object, as an imaginary, which is an idea that mobilizes actors, shapes expectations and knowledge creation, and informs interventions around problem-solution assemblages. Now, in so doing, I try to resist reification and essentialist interpretations of what transformation is. And these assemblages are held together or kept apart through shared or even opposing understandings of and ways to understand reality. And indeed, some assemblages, like in the graphic, fit quite well together. Others seem incommensurable, and they compete with each other for attention, resources, and influence. These struggles can really well be described with another term coined by Annemarie Moore called ontological politics. Based on the experience of writing the final chapter of my thesis, I can say with conviction now that this conceptual approach enables an open and situated engagement with transformation processes, while also acknowledging the role of the researcher in co-constructing meaning through the use of the term transformation or other words associated with particular assemblages. What also emerges from assemblages and interactions between them is an overall orientation of change. Which leads us back to this image, showing the many individual birds that could each represent a single sustainability initiative or a particular problem solution assemblages. They fly together, they relate to each other, they interact with one another, they're constantly changing shape, but with a general orientation. Thank you for your attention, and with this I would like to return the word back to the pro-rector chairing this session. Thank you for your presentation.
The opposition will now be opened by Professor Annick Hommels, who is Professor of Socio-Historical Technology Studies at this university. Professor Hommels.
Thank you. Dear candidates, dear Julia, I would like to start by congratulating you on your dissertation. I think the thesis is a very well-written, clear piece of work, and the articles are also based on solid empirical data collection and analysis. And as you already touched on in your presentation, your cases are highly diverse, ranging from food consumption, mobility, energy transition, basic income, and resource efficiency to the sustainable sharing economy. You all managed to bring this together in an overarching framework around the notion of problem-solution assemblages. And to me, one of the strong points of the dissertation consists in the comparisons of various bodies of scholarly literature dealing with sustainability that you try to really bring together in a very interesting way. Of course, your dissertation also raises some questions and points I would like to discuss a bit further with you. And my first question actually deals with chapter 6. You also described it in your presentation about these narratives of change. And also, the connection between this chapter and the narratives of change to your overarching goal of the dissertation, namely trying to understand the various ways in which scholars and societal actors pursue and theorize transformative change towards sustainability. And my question, the broader question is, what can we learn from these practices and theories of these various actors for actually bringing about sustainable transformations in other settings and contexts? So it's actually a question also about the actionability of your research. But to make it a little bit more specific and also for the purpose of discussing it, I would like to link it really to chapter 6, these narratives of change. Because in the conclusions to this chapter, you say that there is potential of less extreme narratives and practices to pave the way for more radical ones, to inspire promising future pathways towards a more desirable future. So it's about this future transformation, and that more radical narratives could be a way to bring this about or to support this process towards transformation. And my question is, how does this argument for more radical narratives relate to some other ideas you promoted in the same chapter, namely that linkages and collaborations between actors and narratives are desirable, and also that narratives need to succeed in enrolling people, in bringing them together, and that narratives are successful when they resonate with a wide diversity of people. To me, that seems a little bit at odds with the idea of more radical narratives. So my question is, could you discuss the pros and cons of more radical narratives in their potential for bringing about transformations compared to other types of maybe less radical narratives?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for this really good and detailed question, and but also for the compliments on my work. Indeed, for a brief instance, I thought I had written, or we had written something like some narratives pave the way for more radical ones, but it's the other way around. It's the radical ones that may be able to pave the way for other ones that are more amicable or more accessible. And yeah, indeed, I would really like to elaborate on this because we studied so many different social innovation networks. I only presented 4 here and also 4 in the article, but there's others. There's also chapter 7, which looks at basic income, which was also one of the networks studied. And you asked two questions. One was, why did I even look at these narratives in such detail? And the other one was, how are there interrelations between these different narratives? And with regarding to the first, I think I'm really glad that we did this study and that it could become part of my book, because it shows in a really detailed way how these discursive practices matter and are actually at the core of what so much of these societal actors are trying to achieve. So those innovation networks themselves accredit huge importance to the kind of images they use, metaphors they use, and words they use, and the stories they put out there. And I think, based on our scholarly perspectives, we couldn't agree more. Discourse is so important, and it reflects, it can shape the real world. So in that sense, it's I think it's a very important building block to explaining why discourse is part of these problem solution assemblages. But how do these narratives interrelate? It was quite interesting to observe that even within networks, there is a lot of debate and often disagreement about what actually is now the core problem and the core solution. That in itself, I think, paved the way towards building, co-constructing something like a programmatic approach that people could assemble behind. That's inside one initiative. If you now look at how they interrelate, indeed, if you put really radical utopian ideas out there, people think, well, how? This is not going to work. For example, the basic income. It's one of those ideas that's been around for decades. It inspires actually a lot of books, but also real experiments and a lot of civil society initiatives that try to do this on a smaller scale. It's so radical, so sort of out there beyond the current systems that it just seems unattainable. But at the same time, it paves the way for ideas that, could be sort of a stepping stone. They're not the whole 9 yards, but they are something like an allowance for children, for example, in many countries, for poorer families in Brazil, or recently, was it Ireland, who put up a basic income for artists. So these really radical narratives can pave the way for smaller steps towards transformative change. That would be my answer.
Are you satisfied with the answer, Professor Hommels?
Yes, thank you. Also nice that you made a connection to another chapter in relation to this point. Thank you.
Okay. The opposition will be continued by Professor Frances Fahey. She is Professor of Geography at the University of Galway in Ireland. Professor Fahey.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Julia, my first question relates exactly to the slide we have on screen here today, and that title of your work, that concept, that notion of transformation multiple. It's both elegant and provocative, and indeed one of your first propositions. But to what extent is multiplicity itself desirable for sustainability? And I'm asking you here to kind of zoom out from your presentation today, but the idea of, does it foster creativity, inclusiveness, or can it impede coordinated action?
Sorry, the last word, can it compete?
Can it impede? Is it a barrier? Is it, just more broadly? You explained very well in your presentation and within the thesis, obviously, the relevance to your frameworks, but more broadly.
Yeah, thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for complimenting the title and the image that I also both quite like. And I was so glad that I came across this image at some point, because it really signifies these dynamics. And that's also what you're pointing towards. This multiplicity, does it impede our change or our desire to move towards sustainability, or is it actually conducive? Such a big question. And I think it's very desirable. It's really important. And in fact, this multiplicity, the transformation multiple itself, points to the importance of politics in all of this? So obviously we have all of these hegemonic actors and forces. We live in this colonial, hegemonic, capitalist, patriarchic system. And we have so many initiatives that strive towards sustainability within that system. So things like green growth or also renewable energy fit quite well into that current system. And then you have all of these other multiple, sometimes quite radical, alternative views on the current system, but also on potential other systems. And it's really not like there is one future system that all of these actors agree on, not at all, the contrary. But this multiplicity keeps us on our toes, I think, and keeps us reflecting on the fact whether or not we're actually achieving transformation or not. And I would say that's also why, well, no, actually that wasn't the question, but that's also why I think it's really important to take a stance also as a researcher within this flock of birds and position yourself, if not outspokenly, at least internally.
That leads very well on to my second question, which is more specific and related to your positionality statement, which really, you know, when taken together with your research heuristic, it's quite a significant methodological innovation. So I'm very curious as to the reflective challenges of being both a participant and an analyst in transformation research. So I'm thinking particularly of the two of the three papers you presented, where you were part of a European team, Energize and Transit. So you're now reflecting on your own projects. They become part of the empirical material of your thesis. And I'm wondering if you could tell us more or critically reflect on the challenges of that, please.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for that crucial question. Indeed, I struggled at times, because in some projects you're confronted with particular perspectives or approaches that you yourself are not fully, that you don't fully subscribe to. I really appreciated those projects which allowed a broad conceptual approach, and I think actually all of these fall into that. So I felt comfortable always. But yeah, it's important to, while you carry out project work, at the same time sort of distance yourself. I think that's why it was so nice to write the book, because it allowed me to take that step back and look at what I did in the middle of all of it from a distance and reflect a bit more on how those things that we did, well, I call it in practice, but in research practice at the time, could also be looked at or understood. And you know, it made me realize how much each of these projects is part of an assemblage as well, sometimes of several because they overlap, and then it works because we work interdisciplinarily. But there have also been quite fierce discussions on what kind of particular perspective or approach we would now like to pursue. And then it's even harder to sort of, you know, once you chose a conceptual approach, to translate this or operationalize this into intervention even. So that was a really good experience, both being part of those teams, but also looking back at it and reflecting on the process.
Thank you, dear candidate. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you. I take it that you're satisfied with the answers. Good. Then the opposition will be continued online by Dr. Aniek Hebink. She's senior researcher at DRIFT, Dutch Research Institute for Transitions at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Dr. Hebink.
Yes, thank you. Dear candidate, dear Julia, first of all, congratulations on a very rich thesis, which I really enjoyed reading. I appreciated the rich demonstration of how transitions are never singular, but how they consist of multiple overlapping and sometimes competing transformation efforts, but also how they are shaped by the problem-solution assemblages that manifest across both science and society. And I also like to start my question with this notion of problem-solution assemblages by referring to proposition number 3. So if somebody could please read this out.
Problem solution assemblages are stabilized through territorializing and destabilized through deterritorializing dynamics.
Yes, thank you. So your thesis applies a research heuristic to analyze these problem solution assemblages across 3 conceptual strands: sustainability transitions, socioeconomic transformations, and sustainable consumption. So I have 2 questions relating to heuristic. The first one is, could you reflect on how your heuristic helped you identify and interpret stabilizing and destabilizing dynamics within each strand, as well as across the strands? And in particular, in that question, I'm essentially interested in whether it was simply a pragmatic tool to organize your analysis, or whether it provided deeper insights that you might otherwise not have seen. And my second question, being a transition scholar myself, I'm curious to hear how your work and your heuristic in specific can advance sustainability transitions research, and in particular in its ability to generate action-oriented insights.
Esteemed opponent, thank you so much for the nice words about my work, and also for these 2 really important questions. Now I'll start with the first one. I'm not sure if I fully understood what you were going after, because I did not use the heuristic of problem solution assemblages to find out or to look at stabilizing and destabilizing elements within these research strands, but rather the heuristic helped me to better understand how these research strands relate to many other actors or elements in these assemblages. And I mean, as a transition scholar yourself, you're really well aware how transition as a concept emerged because policymakers had a question, and it was developed in the Netherlands, and basically has been a success story as a concept since. It spread globally, there is this big network that uses it, and policymakers remain inspired by it. So very clearly, it fits in this assemblage. It seems to resonate with many other elements in a particular assemblage that is concerned with orchestrating change through policy with a somewhat strong focus on technology. And maybe to add to this, of course, these stabilizing and destabilizing elements, I still feel inspired by this heuristic, and I would actually like to think about this some more. But what I could already show in my thesis is that, well, there were the complicated words of territorialization and deterritorialization. Basically, they describe that these assemblages are a social space, and there are elements both within assemblages but also external to them that impact dynamics within these assemblages. So, for example, if there is a political change or an economic change, assemblages may destabilize or stabilize. That's one of those elements that I think is really important to keep an eye on. But then there's all these interesting inside dynamics, which we, for example, looked at in these social innovation transition transformation initiatives that show how internal debate and also learning through practices make some of these elements change. So, for example, new metaphors enter the stage, or even new sort of recipes for change become more prominent. And I think this quite nicely leads to the second question that you asked about these action-oriented insights. I mean, we already observed in many of these studies these assemblages in action, both within these societal initiatives, but also the dynamics between societal and scholarly perspectives. And to translate this to action, I think I would like to point to all of these other authors that keep arguing for opening up transformative change, keeping it multiple, and basically empowering the more marginalized people or initiatives to also effectuate changes to their benefit. And maybe if it boils down to a very concrete initiative, I mentioned at the very end of the final chapter, things like living labs and other experimental settings where stakeholder groups collaborate on trying to instigate change. I think being aware that there are these assemblages and that each person who enters this collaborative space is subscribed to at least one or probably maybe a couple assemblages. This awareness, I think, would really help to make people aware of these differences and ideally strengthen collaboration, sort of both. I mean, first reflection and then collaboration, because I think it increases appreciation for these other perspectives and achieves also something like maybe a broader repertoire of ways to achieve change, or at least try to achieve change.
And maybe to deepen that question, so how might this notion of these assemblages, these problem solution assemblages, how might they enrich the study of sustainability transitions, or how might they change the study of sustainability transitions as we see it today?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that question. I do elaborate on this a bit in my final chapter, because I also found it really important to think about what the heuristic means for those, or could mean for these different strands of research. And I think, well, I'm actually curious myself how the research community will respond to it. But just sort of looking at it from my own point of view, sitting at my desk, thinking about this question, I came to realize that, well, transition research is part of particular assemblages more than others. I think it's good to be self-aware of this. It relates back to this question of positionality. And at the same time, there is this importance in transition thinking. You have these different levels of how you look at the world, and I think problem solution assemblages are one way to describe how these different levels interact. So in that sense, I think it adds a new perspective that merits further investigation, but I didn't do that yet.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are you satisfied with the answers?
Yes.
Okay, then thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Denver Nixon. He's researcher of just and sustainable transitions at this university.
Thanks.
Dr. Nixon.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I first want to express my appreciation for the improvements and additions that you did in the latest draft of the thesis. I felt like things really were nicely clarified, and your main concepts of the problem solution assemblages, which you were just talking about, as well as a web of entangled elements and web of constraints. I quite like those as sort of heuristics, thinking tools. I also really appreciated the fact that you use sort of almost like 1990s literature for the sensitizing concepts in particular. And I like the way you didn't shy away from the fact that that literature was from the 1990s, because it was very applicable and very useful. So I appreciated that. I also thought it was overall a very impressive effort at trying to bring together many different theories and substantive foci. Something that is quite difficult to do. My question would be that the dissertation is very much focused on that note, focused on categories and lots of categories, different categories within theories, different categories within the heuristics, et cetera. I would like to know more about how the partitions between these categories might affect your interpretation. Some of it is there in the dissertation, but how stepping back a little bit, what are your thoughts on this whole idea of categories, both preconceived categories that you brought in from other theories, as well as some of the categories that you were sort of pioneering there. One just very quick sort of example of some place where I was really thinking about that was on page 144 with the idea of capabilities versus competencies, or between meanings versus values and expectations. There seems like potential overlap there. How did you struggle with that, dealing with that, and the differences and the, I guess, the importance of definitions in dealing with the categories? Thanks.
All right. Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words. And I actually have to return the thanks or the compliments, because it was basically the comments by the committee that really helped me to review some of the things. And I'm glad that you liked the revisions done. Yeah, indeed, a lot of categories. I did struggle with that a great deal. I will continue to struggle with that, but I think that's our job. Basically, it's at the core of the job, trying to sort of find suitable labels for what we observe. And that's why it's useful to often look in the past, because people have come up with great concepts back in the days that are perfectly applicable to what we observe today. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, innovation is a good thing, but it's also very good to go back to the originals and learn from their perspective on the world. And I found as well that these categories or concepts still apply. They still work. Some of them are really hard to use. And, since they were coined, others have tried and also showed, well, it's hard to operationalize. And that's actually something I struggled with until the very end. So in that sense, some categories are useful for research. They are very operationalizable and really inspire new insights. And others are really useful, but very hard to work with. Not really sure what to do with those yet. But what you specifically point to, so was it capabilities and what was the other?
It was
competencies.
That's right.
Yeah. These pertain to different conceptual perspectives. And I think, as I described in my positionality statement, I do not subscribe to a single scholarly perspective. I think they all have their merits, and they just, they shed light on different things. And that's why I think it's important or useful to, for example, talk about both behavior and practices. It's not quite the same. They emphasize different aspects, but by using both and being aware of both, how they're conceptualized and also used in practice, really inspires broader understandings of change or possibilities for change. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. How am I doing for time? Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Another question. I am very focused on epistemology, as you might guess. And I'm just wondering how, my main question really, I think, is to what extent is what you have done here in the dissertation not an epistemological investigation? Because within the dissertation, of course, it very much talks about, I'm going to stick with ontologies here, with the recognition that these are socially constructed and they're very often political and conflictual, et cetera. But I feel that epistemology, with its questions of, how do we know and why and what does this mean, that I guess I just wondered, how come you decided not to frame things with epistemology specifically? Why you decided to stick with ontology? That said, I noticed actually in your presentation that you have epistemology added in there again. So, yeah.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for that follow-up question. And now I know which assessment report was yours. yeah, I mean, I stuck it out even though you raised this comment before, because both are important, as I showed now in my presentation. I mean, if you are part of this social constructivist research community, you're just very aware how all of this very much interrelates. And at some point, I also used the word ontoepistemology, just recognizing that it's basically one, very closely interrelated, but not the same. And the reason why I decided to stick with ontologies is that I really wanted to emphasize the role that also epistemology plays in shaping activities in the real world, having real impacts. So knowledge and ideas just translate into or inform action and then bring about something in reality. And since I looked at both scientific and societal initiatives, I just found it really important to remain firmly established in the real, it's the real word. Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nixon. Then we will continue with another round of questions, and I'll give the floor to Professor Vee for asking.
Jens.
Oh, sorry, Jens. Still enough time. Don't worry. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Jens Lachmunt. He is lecturer of Sociology of Science and Technology at this university. Dr. Lachmunt, the floor is all yours.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Dear candidate, thank you also for this interesting thesis. I very much appreciate the complexity of your work. On the one hand, all the case studies about all these different transformation initiatives, but also the theoretical concepts. I learned a lot about very specific discussions in the transformation discourse that I was also not fully aware before. So it was really very beneficial also to read your thesis and all these detailed reviews about it. But I've got a question about the issue of multiplicity, which also came up earlier. And my question is specific. In the answer earlier, you already mentioned politics as a very important dimension. And that's also what you say at the end of your thesis on chapter 2, in the last chapter on page 213. You conclude that, quote, crucially, the different assemblages do not coexist peacefully as competition for resources and support of any kind of supportive spheres, unquote. So at the core of the sustainability multiple, there is political struggle for you. I found this argument quite possible. So if there are different ideas, different concepts, then people will definitely have preferences for one and the others, and there will be some struggle. But when I looked back then, after reading that sentence and tried to find something about these struggles in your individual chapters, I did not find so much. Mm-hmm. So, of course, there was politics. Somehow the imaginaries of these actors, they were talking about capitalism, maybe colonialism less, but what you mentioned these different political terms. So these were definitely orientations of some of these actors, but actual politics and struggle, competition, maybe you could have said a bit more about that. And that's, there is a lot about the differences and similarities of the differences, and you give very nice tables, you present them there. But the contestations and their dynamics, and I missed that a little bit. And it's not only at the level of the case study, I missed it also a little bit in your triangle of this conceptual space. To me, that looked more like, you also call it a conceptual space, more logical relations between certain positions, and more a map of work program where kind of intellectual or division of intellectual labor between the different concepts to fill in the gaps in this space, but it doesn't look like a map of with fault lines and struggles going on. And maybe you can expand a bit more. How do these approaches contest each other? How do some of them gain tractions and others get marginalized? How are these contestations also embedded in broader societal struggles and power relations? I would like to ask you to expand a little bit more on this political aspect of the ontological politics that you're talking about.
Esteemed opponent, thank you so much for raising this question, which well, indeed, as you say, I didn't elaborate too much about this in my book, but I'm really happy to try to elaborate now, and I, for myself, would actually quite like to think about this some more in the future, so I could make a start, perhaps now in this setting. So the reason that I drew up this triangle, which makes it look like an amicable, peaceful space, is I wanted to show the complementarity of perspectives, that they're not the same, but they look at the same from very different perspectives. And indeed, I could have drawn fault lines, for example, with respect to the question, what role does, or what agency does the individual have versus the community? But I didn't, because I really wanted to show that both is true and both is important, and ideally initiatives, whether scholarly or societal, address both. So I didn't, put in barriers. I kept the space open, indeed. If I would now try to elaborate more on the question of complementarity versus struggle and competition between assemblages, I'm afraid this would be indeed a new study, because I arrived at assemblages in the end. I think I can show that they're there and what they consist of, but I haven't looked at in detail how they struggle. But there are cases that point a little bit towards the struggle. So, for example, in my chapters on scholarly perspectives, I show how different perspectives highlight different aspects, and how this is not always commensurable. As I just said, ideally then both is recognized and used in practice. And in these other, actually there are a bit more chapters looking at societal actors and their different initiatives. I think these struggles are a lot more open, because they have a lot of meetings and workshops to discuss these very issues quite in depth. And they also often develop methods to facilitate exchanges about what is it now that we really see to be the problem, what we really see to be the solution, and what can we, as a little initiative, do to instigate any sort of change towards the goal that we see as important. And there is a lot of struggle, both within these singular initiatives, but also between them. So we could see in this transit project that I mentioned, that these initiatives are really aware about each other as well. And they're very happy to join hands when they have a very similar project in mind. So, for example, degrowth is one of those concepts that quite a few of these transformative social innovation initiatives would subscribe to. By far not all, but quite a few. And this is where they then join hands and do things together, and then in other ways, they do not align. So that's actually, it's quite interesting. And I would, as I said, I would like to think about this some more, but I think not today. I hope that answers your question, though.
It's time for one follow-up question?
Oh, yes. Okay,
Oh, yes.
Then I can ask one more, which is related to the notion of the problem solution assemblage. And so thereby you draw explicitly on Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. And so that's why you call it assemblage and not just problem solution packages or whatever. So while many scholars have used this concept to emphasize the complex and rhizomatic and constantly emerging nature of agency and of entities, I have the impression that this is less relevant for you. You seem to locate these dynamic aspects of assemblage thinking mainly at the level of the transformation multiple, of which each of the assemblages forms part. But the way you describe the assemblages themselves is astonishingly linear. So there are driving actors who confront focal systems, they articulate problem definitions, and then, almost by logical consequences, arrive at certain preferred solutions. That's at least how I have the feeling that you suggest that linearity. And it was only in chapter 7 on the basic income that you trace the dynamic development of an issue over time. But for the rest, most of your analysis are snapshots of situations in which these elements already fit into an overarching linear logic. Sometimes you call it a narrative or whatever, but it's always already in place. And I can imagine that by zooming deeper into each of your cases, you might probably also have arrived at a more dynamic feature in which all these elements have their own trajectories, so that probably solutions can search for problems instead of problems searching for solutions. That assumptions might probably be generated from consequences, or in which all the elements are only very loosely connected and have their own life. And I would like you to reflect a bit more on the potential of the concept of problem-solution assemblage, also to shed light on such more dynamic aspects, where less linear ways of putting these elements together.
Esteemed opponent, thank you so much for this follow-up question, which again goes a bit beyond what I already did. But I'm really happy to engage with that question because it points to such an important aspect. So indeed, it's quite interesting how somehow when we step back and reflect, we fall back into logics of linearity. I often observe that in other contexts as well, when, for example, you've opened up broad deliberative spaces about innovation trajectories, and then you invite multiple actors to become involved, take great care to achieve equality and representation, and then somehow at the end something comes out that resonates with more of the same and somehow follows a logical, very linear structure. So that appears to be something how we're wired. And I really appreciate that you alert me to this issue in my work. Because indeed, when I stepped back and reflected and I told the story of how assemblages come into be and interact, it's quite linear. I mean, I did, as you said, in some of the cases, showed detailed struggles. And I really enjoyed tracing these in all of the different initiatives. Or, let's say, dynamics between them, right? Which we see in these energy consumption initiatives. In one neighborhood, several initiatives may collide, and there may be synergies, but also less of complementarity. So that's quite interesting to think about. You called it the trajectories of elements, and I feel very inspired by this because it would allow us to, for example, pick any element, actually be it an actor or a metaphor or an institution, and look at how it relates to many different assemblages, in what way. And I think that would point out how well, I think it would point out how some of the assemblages are hegemonic or more prominent or get larger attention compared to others. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for that point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lachmunt, for asking such inspiring questions. We still have a little bit of time left for a second round for Professor Fahey to ask additional questions. Professor Fay.
Thank you for this opportunity. Dear candidate, I have two possibly interlinked but hopefully short questions. My first is in relation to the study that you presented, one of them, turning off the gas tap. That chapter really provided excellent empirical kind of grounding for your conceptual arguments. But before joining this committee, I reviewed how this work had been received more broadly, and the book has been accessed over 114,000 times since you published that in 2019. So my question to you is, with reflection, some could say, since then COVID, since then wars have broken out, more energy crisis. So to what extent could this work have, be titled sort of before its time? Or have you given any thought since maybe 2019 how the work could be received now, or was it before its time? And I guess my final question to you is really to do, you've dedicated the thesis, Max and Thill, may there always be hope is your dedication, and that's echoed in your conclusion, which really talks about this hopeful note on plural sort of transformation efforts. And I guess as a final question, I'd love to know what gives you the optimism about the current trajectories within sustainability. Short questions.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for both of these questions. I wasn't aware that the book had been downloaded more than 100,000 times, which is amazing. It's good to hear. How would it be received now? Well, I think we noticed quite soon after the project was finished that it was a little bit ahead of its time, in the sense that with COVID, people stuck at home working from home. Lots of practices changed, energy use related practices. And then we saw the war on Ukraine, which again, which made us reconsider very important choices about how we build our energy systems and how we use energy. So in that sense, we were before the time, but the book is still there, so it can still be read, which is great, which is maybe why it was downloaded so often. And to follow up on your second question, whether I'm hopeful or not.
You may still finish your question.
Yeah.
Sentence.
Yeah, thank you, for Rector. I'm not sure if I'm much of an optimist, to be honest, given the world we find ourselves in. But what has always given me hope is these little initiatives that we look at, and people's perseverance and motivation to try to do even the littlest of positive change that is sort of within their realm, their agency of possibilities.
Okay,
that
thank
gives
you.
me hope.
Dear candidates, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The Defense Committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I requested you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
All right.
No, I don't think so. Oh yeah, you're supposed to, they didn't say that. When I get the diploma.
Next to sit and now here.
I think so, I don't know. I'll just stay put.
Please be seated. Julia Backhaus. The Defense Committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the Defense Committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Your supervisor, Professor Kemp, is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please. Does this work? It does. Shall we do it in English or in Dutch?
Whatever you prefer. Or German?
German. Well, that would be. Yeah, lieber Julia. Oh no. Okay, we'll do it in English. Julia, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Julia Backhaus, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
There it is. Well, congratulations.
Please be seated.
So the laudatio will now be spoken by Professor van Lente.
Dear Dr. Backhaus, dear Julia, here we are in the aula, you, René, me, all the others, 12.5 years, a copper PhD. Normally in a laudatio one would reflect on the path taken. In your case it was not a path, it was a complete roadmap. With side paths, highways, parking lots, unpaved roads, U-turns. A PhD multiple, for sure. I remember the start in the early 2010s at ISIS in the Kapoenstraat, at the faculty of FSH. The faculty no longer exists. The center has another name and another location. I have another job. You have another job. So many changes. What hasn't changed is your interests in societal transitions and transformations. And the range of initiatives has grown in energy, food, urban planning, as well as the range of theories and practical approaches. Your thesis is fitting here. You were able to highlight the connections between perceived problems and perceived solutions. And as we witnessed today in the academic exchange of you and the opponents, your thesis has a fresh and important contribution. You started your PhD with a head start. You already had research experience at ECN, the Dutch Research Center for Energy and Policy. You already had experience with the topic of transitions. You knew about important theories of transitions and broader social studies on technology. You had experiences with policy evaluation and analysis, so you had a head start. And still, it took 12.5 years. How come? I asked René, and he told me it's a new job in Aachen, sickness of children, Till and Max, birthday parties for Till and Max every year, liquidating a firm of your father-in-law, world problems such as COVID and the energy crisis in 2023. And he added, with every crisis, the German government came to you with the same question. Julia, was sollen wir jetzt machen? Yes, all this is true, but there are also underlying reasons. Reason one, reluctance to choose. Because you had already such a rich overview of theories, experiences, policies, you felt you had to include all of these. And choosing A implies not choosing B, or C, or D. In a sense, your PhD study is an experiment. What happens if you don't choose? You turned this reluctance to choose into a strength. Clearly, there is multiplicity. There are different theories, approaches, and there are different initiatives. We should not deny, we should study the multiplicity. Meanwhile, René was looking for a talented and energetic colleague to work on many European projects, and you really excelled here. You immersed yourself into the projects, propelled collaborators along the way, and when they were slow or failed, you jumped in. Here we come to reason two, perfectionism. When you collaborate in a project, you are the perfect collaborator. And when you teach, you are the perfect tutor. Year after year, students gave you the highest grades. Perfectionism is a strong habit. Reason three, and now I'm really walking on thin ice, but it still matters. Reason three is you are German. You have to do it thoroughly. You turned in drafts, long texts, with many ideas, many pages, many lines, but only with a handful of full stops. René and I had been strong advocates for the full stop. We have been emancipators for the full stop. These three reasons, however, are also your strengths. The reluctance to choose brings your interest to see so many sides of a problem. Very good. The perfectionism brings the question whether something more could be done or said. Very good. Being German. Very good. Julia, you don't give up. You just continue, even without the certainty that there will be glory in the end. You stay loyal, clever, productive. Yes, and yet, as a perfectionist, you tend to only look at the things you're not good at, instead of all the things you are doing so well. Today, however, with all these conversations, with all this feedback, I hope, René hopes, your family hopes, that you just accept this truth. Julia, you are great. Congratulations.
Dear Dr. Backhaus, dear Julia, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate you with this degree that you've just acquired. I also would like to congratulate your mother and your partner who is here today. I thank all those present, and especially the members of the degree committee that are not attached to this university, to participate in this ceremony, and I hereby close this meeting. And go to Que pasa?